Welcome to the complete Legendary Items Guide for the Lord of the Rings Online. The Legendary Items, or LI system, begins around level 50 and is a very important part of character progression beyond that point and even at Endgame. Getting a solid foothold with the system will help ensure your success as you progress through LOTRO. On top of a whole bunch of different Legendary items, tips, and tricks, this guide will focus on the acquisition process, how to use the system and all of its parts, the leveling experience and progression, including at Endgame, its interaction with other LOTRO systems, as well as a few pointers for each class and different builds you can do. To acquire legendary items in LOTRO, you must do a series of level 50 quests located in and around the Walls of Moria, which is an instance transition zone between Eregion in southeast Eriador and Moria. Because these are quests, you can technically acquire your LIs starting at level 45, although you will be doing the quest quite a bit underleveled if you choose to do so. Going through these quests will unlock 2 legendary items for your character. One will be the primary weapon for your class, so for classes that can use one-handed or two-handed weapons, you will actually get to choose whichever type you want. For example, a champion could opt for a two-handed legendary weapon, which would take care of your weapons throughout the rest of the game, or you could choose a one-handed weapon, then you would have to find a random one-handed weapon to dual wield with it. Guardians and other classes that use shields are pretty similar. You can choose a two-handed weapon or you can choose a one-handed weapon so you can equip a shield with it. Notably, you cannot dual wield legendary weapons. The second legendary item you get depends on your class. For all but the Hunter and Warden, this will be your class slot item. So for Beornings, for example, it will be their carving. For Runekeepers, it will be their rune satchel, and so on for each class. Hunters get a legendary melee weapon for their second item, while Wardens get a legendary javelin as a ranged weapon for their second item. By the way, if you are a returning player and have old legendary items from the old system before the 2021 revamp, I do have a couple tutorials on the transition that may also help brand new beginners as a supplement after this guide. To unlock both of your legendary items, you must complete the first book of Volume 2, which again is set for level 50 and is completed mostly within the Walls of Moria. Chronologically, this takes place after you finish all of the pre-Moria zones in Eriador and follows the completion of Volume 1. That said, many players choose to unlock their LIs earlier, and as I cover in my in-depth leveling guide, you can really level however you want in LOTRO, and skipping ahead will not break your character progression. Even if you are in the middle of Volume 1 and want to go ahead and get your LIs, you can always go back to Volume 1 after acquiring your LIs. Either way, to start with Volume 2, Book 1, you will need to talk to Rathwald, who is standing just outside the Walls of Moria on the left side of the instance portal. The portal is located in Eked-Dunnen, the encampment that is in the far southeast of Eregion. If you cannot take a swift travel to Eked-Dunnen, a sure bet is to manually travel there, either from northern Eregion area, or now you can actually come from the west and western Eregion from Before the Shadows. As for Rathwald, he will set you forth on a journey towards Moria. As you continue the book quests in Walls of Moria, you will likely notice a lot of side quests. These are entirely optional, but not only do they give you some decent XP for your character, they do offer some legendary items relevant rewards that you will be able to use when you fully unlock the system. They also don't take a ton of time, so generally I recommend going ahead and doing them, and for all my characters, I do those side quests. Either way, the first important quest is going to be Chapter 9, which will reward you with your first legendary item, your weapon. From the quest reward, you can select the weapon that you want. The exact one will depend on your spec, how you play your character, and just what you want out of your LI. So for example, I recently chose a two-handed sword on my champion because that way I only have to keep up with my LI and I don't really have to worry about finding an updated offhand weapon as I level up. Because legendary items are so powerful with the new system, in most cases a two-hander will be better than dual wielding as well if you are interested in optimizing your damage output. But actually, as a counterexample, I have a captain who I primarily tank and heal on, and I use a shield on him for the increased defenses and stats. So I actually chose a one-handed weapon instead of a two-hander. And the good news with this is that you are not 100% locked into the weapon you choose, but it will take some time before you can replace it if you do want to. But overall, don't fret the decision too much and just go with what you want at the time. And after completing Chapter 9, the next two quests, Chapters 10 and 11, are sort of tutorials for the ally system. If you read the quest text, they will give you a bit of starter information, and they have you go through the process of reforging your legendary weapon. Reforging is an important process as it allows your ally to scale with your character's level, boosting its base power level and allowing you to further build it and later customize it. After this tutorial quest, you can reforge every 5 levels starting at level 56, meaning you can reforge at all the levels that end in 1 and 6 at that point. There are quite a few significant power jumps associated with old expansion eras, so it is very important to remember to reforge as you'll get quite weak without doing so. And just to note, reforging does cost in-game gold and the amount to reforge does go up with level, although in my experience this usually isn't a problem. And while the tutorial quest takes you specifically to Rivendell to reforge, you can talk to any Forge Master to reforge. They are found in many of the bigger camps in the game, and if you are a VIP subscriber, you can actually reforge with the Subscriber Town Services item. So after getting your weapon settled, Chapter 12 takes you back to the Walls of Moria. Notably, Chapter 12 completes the Secret of the Deep Places deed, which means you will have fully unlocked the legendary item system. After Chapter 12, Chapter 13 is very brief and rewards you with your second LI. This one, you have to choose the item that is actually relevant for your class, so do be careful. By the way, after Chapter 13 with your second LI, you will be able to reforge right away. The next reforge for both LIs at this point will then be level 56. And at this point, I do have to congratulate you on unlocking 2 of the most powerful items in the entire game. Your legendary weapon will blow your old weapons out of the water, while the class item may have less of a direct impact. It should still give you quite the boost, and it becomes pretty considerable actually at higher levels. Now we really start to get into the details of your legendary item system now that you actually have it fully unlocked. The Secret of Deep Places deed from Chapter 12 is very important because first, it unlocks the seasonal legendary items reward track, which we'll talk about in a moment. And second, it allows you to enter the Archive of Traceries located in Elrond's house in Rivendell. It's up on the second floor to the left here. The Archive of Traceries is a wondrous hall that contains just about everything you need to kit your legendary items out. This is an important location to keep in mind, and you will often see me here in background clips as I work on my own LIs. For the legendary item system, there are 3 primary item types that interact with the system that ultimately are used to build out and empower your LIs. First, there are traceries, which are items that you slot into your LI, giving various boosts. Second, there are enhancement runes, which, as the name implies, enhance your traceries. Third are heritage runes. These grant you legendary item XP. All of these LI system items are account bound, so you can freely pass items around between your characters on your account. Legendary item XP is quite important in LOTRO, and generally, you acquire LI XP from the same things that give your character XP, as well as from these heritage runes. Item XP is what progresses the reward track, which is a seasonal reward system in LOTRO, and as you progress through it, you will unlock a bunch of useful items, specifically traceries and enhancement runes for your LIs. The reward track does include some non-LI related rewards, but its focus is on legendary items. Every character on your account, or technically on a per server basis, contributes to the reward track. So if you are leveling, say, 2 characters, both contribute to your account's reward track as you get LI XP on them. As a reminder, to contribute with LI XP, both characters would have to have completed the Secret of Deep Places. Now, as for the rewards in the reward track, each reward can only be claimed once by one character. The rewards themselves are going to be account bound though, and I'll have more details on the reward track later, but that is the basics of how it works with item XP. And the last note I have here is on ancient scripts. I'll cover these in more detail later as well, but this is a currency that is exclusively used in the LI system. With ancient scripts, you can barter for traceries, enhancement runes, and even new LIs that are just like the ones you got from the original introduction quest. Ancient scripts are going to be acquired from unused traceries, but more largely in part from the reward track. Ancient scripts do have a cap of 10,000, just to note. So these 3 items with Traceries, Enhancement runes, and Heritage runes, along with LI XP with the reward track and Ancient scripts, these all comprise the Legendary item system. Traceries and Enhancement runes are the primary items to actually improve your LIs, while everything else is there just to support your acquisition of Traceries and Enhancement runes. As we move deeper into the section on Traceries and Enhancement runes, it will be a bit long as it is very detailed to have a complete and thorough guide. If you're looking for something shorter on just getting started with the LI system, I will have that at the end of this section, and I will likely have a quick guide on what is important and what is not important in terms of progression with Traceries and Enhancement runes as you level up in the future. Also, as a quick disclaimer here, at the time of recording this video, LOTRO is actually going to get a stat squish soon, and the numbers you see in this video and all the clips that I have are actually from before the stat squish. So everything in this guide is still applicable, but after this update, stat numbers will be smaller than what is shown in the video, although all the relative and comparative value of numbers will be the same. I mainly bring this up if you're curious why your own numbers are perhaps way different from this video. With your legendary items, you will probably notice there are little boxes in the tooltip with the text empty slot. These are for traceries. The way the LI system works is you slot items called traceries into your legendary items. Traceries can have a variety of effects, such as increasing your stats, boosting a certain type of damage, and making a particular skill more effective, among a whole bunch of other things. To start off, after the first reforge, each LI will have 4 tracery slots. By level 140, each LI has 12 tracery slots. So it does go up quite a bit. Also, as you level up and importantly actually reforge your LIs, you should occasionally notice a new tracery slot unlocked on your LIs. Traceries are divided into 4 types, and these do matter as your LIs will only have a certain number of slots available for certain tracery types. The first type is a Heraldric tracery, sometimes just called a Heraldry, which is the primary stat booster for your LI, as these give a large sum of stats. The second type is Word of Power, which gives some boost to your character's roll, such as AoE damage, healing over time, single target critical chance and damage, reduced incoming physical damage, and all sorts of stuff like that. Again, there are a whole lot more, but what they do is empower your character's roll, allowing you to further refine your character's overall build to your liking. Word of Power traceries are unique, so between your 2 allies you can only have one of a particular Word of Power tracery slotted. The third tracery type is Word of Mastery. These are dedicated to your class and boost some aspect of your class, such as the effectiveness of a certain ability, or increasing the damage of a certain set of abilities, increasing, say, healing value of a skill, so on and so forth like that. They're just all about your class. You'll probably also notice that Word of Power and Word of Mastery also do give a small stat boost to go along with their primary effect. Also, like Word of Power, Word of Mastery traceries are unique, so between your 2 LIs, you can only have one of a particular Word of Power tracery slotted. And finally, this leaves us with the 4th tracery type, which is Word of Craft. These are a bit more simple in that they just straight up increase a certain stat, such as physical mastery, finesse, evade rating, etc. Importantly, you can equip as many of the same Word of Craft traceries as you want, unless they specify that they are unique use in the tooltip. And that actually also does apply to Heraldry traceries as well. There is a little bit of extra complication to the tracery types though. There are a few Word of Craft set bonuses. Having 2 of the same Word of Craft slotted unlocks the first set bonus, such as Ascendant Light here, which increases light type damage. Then having 2 of those equipped would give you the second set bonus, which in this case increases outgoing healing rating. Typically, only Word of Craft traceries contribute to their own set bonus, but at the level 140 cap, you may run into crafted heraldries, which actually contribute to Word of Craft set bonuses. For example, a Heraldry of the Mending Owl contributes to the Perfect Healing Word of Craft set bonus. These special crafted traceries actually provide the exact same stats as their non-crafted counterpart, the only difference being the contribution to the Word of Craft set bonus. As a complete beginner around level 50, you don't need to worry about that, but if you're at the level cap, and for future level caps we anticipate that this will stay pretty similar, I did want to bring up how that works. So as I mentioned earlier, you have 4 tracery slots per ally to start. This includes 1 heraldry each, 2 word of mastery each, and 1 word of craft, and that does mean no word of power tracery slots to start. By the level 56 reforge though, you will gain a word of power for each ally so that you at least have 1 of each tracery type slot on your allies. By the current level cap with the level 136 reforge, between your 2 allies you will now have 2 heraldry, 5 word of power, 12 word of mastery, and 4 word of craft traceries in total. To equip traceries, you need to open your character panel with the C key by default and drag the legendary item to the flame icon at the bottom right column of your gear. This opens up the ally customization window. From here, you can drag a tracery to the slot that matches the tracery type. When you want to upgrade or replace an already existing tracery, that will destroy the current tracery slotted in your ally that you're replacing. However, traceries can be saved by first unslotting them using a tracery reclamation scroll. These reclamation scrolls are not very common in regular LOTRO gameplay, but are an optional reward from, for example here, mission weekly quests, some festivals, and for barter with ancient script currency. Typically, I do not actually recommend worrying about unslotting traceries unless you want a very specific one for an alt to use, because again, traceries are account bound. And especially while leveling, it's just not really worth actually using these to save traceries. Now, traceries that you do not want may be disenchanted with the Flame of Ancalamir. I'll have more details on this later, but disenchanting a tracery will give you some of the ancient script barter currency, and it's always better to go ahead and disenchant an unwanted tracery than sell it to a vendor for like a few silver. You may also notice that traceries have a certain level range attached to them, such as the first set here, which say minimum level 45, maximum level 95. That means that after level 95, the tracery will become useless, as in it won't provide any benefit anymore. You can tell which traceries are below your level if they have a red border around their icon. So traceries have different level ranges and are sometimes referred to their tier. So at the baseline, traceries go from level 45 to 95, which would be tier 1. The next tier is 86 to 105, then 101 to 115, all the way up to 131 to 150. And presumably with the upcoming expansion, we would have 141 to 160, which would be tier 8 for the level 150 cap. These level ranges might seem a bit odd at first, but they are actually associated with old expansion level caps in the game. After the level cap of the old expansion, there is a new tier of traceries at the next level range. Essentially, what all this means is you will need to replace your traceries with higher level ones as you level up, and it becomes more frequent starting at level 86 when you get to the second tier. This does also mean that for each new expansion and level cap added to the game in the future, you will need a new set of traceries to be fully up to date. Although it is good to note that tracery level ranges technically span 2 level caps. So with the level 150 cap expansion coming later this year, you can technically use your level 131 to 150 traceries. That said, their item level will be lower. This essentially gives you some breathing room though to find new traceries in a new level bracket before you completely outlevel your previous ones. And I should point out that the primary effect of Word of Mastery and Power traceries does not actually change with the different level ranges. Only the stats on the traceries change to be more commensurate with your character's level. Each level range tier of traceries has a jump in item level as well. Item level is going to be mainly important in the enhancing mechanic that we will get to in a moment. Like gear and LOTRO, traceries have different quality levels. Yellow or common traceries have the lowest value, purple or rare are slightly better, teal or incomparable are even better, while gold or legendary are the best quality. Notably for Word of Power and Mastery traceries, the higher quality can have a significant boost to the tracery's effectiveness by increasing their primary affix. Just for example here, compare the 16% bear form damage to the 22% for the Beorning. That's about 1.4 times the effectiveness. So quality is definitely important. Not only does reforging increase the number of traceries you can slot, but it also increases your ally's primary affix. So for weapons, this is going to be weapon DPS, unless it's a tactical weapon such as the Runekeeper's Runestone, Loremaster Staff, Minstrel's main hand weapon, and so on. Then it will increase the tactical damage rating, which is really the tactical version or like magic spellcaster version of weapon DPS. The class item has a primary affix such as tactical healing rating, incoming healing, and so on. This will also increase as you reforge. These are very important in boosting your ally's general power level as you reforge. The last thing that reforging does is increase the weapon item level, and this is where a little bit more complication is added to the system. So normally, item level is just a number that gives you some indication to the general stat value on gear. For allies, it sort of does that with like weapon DPS and the other affixes, but more importantly, it indicates how high item level your traceries can go. So as a note for the level cap, the maximum item level does progressively increase with major updates through an expansion era. This does mean you will actually have to reforge your ally with these updates to stay fully up to date and at the high power level, even though your character is already at the cap. I really cannot stress enough how important reforging is and making sure when major updates come out to check if you can reforge your allies. But ultimately, this is just another layer on the relatively basic to start tracery system. With the items called Enhancement runes, you can raise the item level of traceries up to the level of the legendary item itself. So technically, actually, when using an Enhancement rune, you raise the item level of the tracery slot and not the tracery itself. So for example, if you use an Enhancement rune on a tracery and place that tracery, the new tracery will be the same item level as the one it replaces. Raising the item level of the tracery only boosts the number stats on traceries, and for Word of Mastery and Word of Power traceries, that means it does not impact the primary affix, such as AoE damage. Because of this, it is best to use enhancement runes on Heraldric traceries first, then it doesn't really matter which after that. Usually it's just whichever tracery provides the most valuable stat to you when enhanced with an enhancement rune, such as Vitality. So to apply enhancement runes, you need to open the LI that you want to enhance a tracer on by dragging it again to that flame icon in the character panel. From this point, you can drag the enhancement rune to the tracery that you want to enhance. If you have a stack of enhancement runes, you can select how many you want to use, and there you go. You have an enhanced tracery slot now. And just like traceries themselves, and enhancement runes have level range tiers that perfectly actually match the tracery level ranges. So enhancement runes can only be used on traceries that are in the same level range. So tier 1 enhancement runes work on tier 1 traceries, which again are level 50 to 95. Tier 2 only work on the level 86 to 100 range, and so on through all the different tiers. So once your character enters into a new level range and you get new traceries, your old enhancement runes won't actually provide you any use anymore. Plus, the base tracery item level goes up with each level range, so they're always more effective than lower level range traceries. Back to the enhancement runes though, they have enhancement limits, which is the highest item level they can enhance a tracery. For example, the first enhancement rune is a yellow quality or common enhancement rune that has an enhancement limit of 70, meaning it can only raise the tracery to a maximum item level of 70. When you start out, this is actually not an issue, as your LI does not even go above level 70 until you do the level 71 reforge when it goes to 75. And again, the LI item level is what controls the maximum item level of your tracery slots. And at this point, we get to where the quality of enhancement runes comes in. Just like traceries and gear and all the such, they go from yellow to gold, and in each level range tier, the yellow will have the lowest enhancement limit, and gold will have the highest enhancement limit, which is typically the full cap at the end of the level range. Because of this, it is important to use the lowest quality enhancement runes to start. So for the previous example, you cannot use a yellow enhancement rune with an enhancement limit of 70 on a tracery that is already level 70. At this point, you will have to use at least a purple enhancement rune. And this becomes more important at the level cap to ensure you are basically not wasting your higher quality and more rare enhancement runes. Importantly, the base item level of a tracery in the next level range is always one higher than the enhancement limit of the previous level range. So for example, the first level range starts at item level 51 and has a maximum item level of 125 for the level 45 to 95 traceries. A level 86 to 105 tracery has a base item level of 126, which sets its baseline level already above the maximum enhanced level of the previous tracery level range. So to be completely honest, I just don't think it is worth worrying about enhancement runes while leveling. There is no reason to not use them, but since you replace the traceries with higher item level versions as you level up, it all kind of gets wasted, so to speak, anyway. Again, I still do actually end up prioritizing enhancing heraldries while leveling. I think it makes a lot more sense to look at enhancement runes in the context of an expansion's level cap. So with the current 140 cap at the time of recording this video, the base item level of the level 131 to 150 tier 7 traceries is 450. The yellow quality enhancement runes can enhance these traceries to 460, the purple can do 480, teal 490, and finally gold would be 499. Item level 499 would be the final reforge of the character at the level 140 cap, and thus to have a maximum power level 140 character, you need gold enhancement runes to get your traceries to that cap of 499. This also demonstrates why it is important to use the lowest quality enhancement runes first. If you use up all of your teal enhancement runes, say below item level 480 for example, then you have nothing left to actually get past 480. Also, for an example of maximum item level increasing throughout an expansion era and level cap, at the time of recording this video, the maximum item level for a 140 character is 490. So despite the next expansion and level cap being just a few months away at this point, we still don't even have the maximum level 140 item level cap unlocked. This is a bit complicated, but it basically means that gold enhancement runes either need to be saved for when the cap is raised before the expansion, or used suboptimally on traceries below item level 490. The same idea will apply to a fresh level 150 cap with the expansion, where the item level cap will likely first match just the yellow enhancement runes limit, then purple and so on progressing forward with major updates. At the start of the expansion, instead of using purple, teal, and gold enhancement runes suboptimally, I personally will be saving them for when the item level cap is raised. This is the same strategy I applied to the level 140 cap. But after level 140, the level 141 to 160 traceries would follow with a base item level of 500, surpassing again the previous maximum that we have at the 140 cap by 1. The same concept applies to all the level ranges below the level cap, but unless you are specifically capping your character at an old level cap or whatever you play in the game to actually make it matter for you, in general in LOTRO gameplay and progression, I don't think it is worth worrying at all about enhancement runes as you level. Just be sure to go ahead and use them, as after you outlevel them, they are only good for alts or to sell to a vendor for a few silver. But despite my recommendation to simply not care about enhancement runes while normal leveling in LOTRO, I did include this detailed section to be complete and prepare you all for either the current or a future level cap in the game. At this point, we have covered traceries and enhancement runes, two of the most important items in legendary item progression. But how do you actually get these? Well, there are actually many resources, and as I pointed out earlier, item XP with the reward track and the ancient script barter currency are two of the big ones. But you do also directly get traceries and enhancement runes as rewards while adventuring in Middle Earth as well. Starting with the Walls of Moria quests in the book series to get your first LIs, and throughout the rest of the game, various quests will reward LI system items. Not every quest will give you something for your LIs, but it's kind of like gear, and sometimes you'll find LI items as a quest reward. I will say that in my experience, this is most common with book quests and occasionally for more major quests within a zone set of side quests. If you're doing kind of prototypical questing to level up and progressing through the game stories and epic quests, these will serve as your primary starter for traceries and enhancement rune progression. I should point out that the tracery boxes that you get for quest rewards will give random traceries. So there are times you may get duplicates or a tracery that is close to useless for you. You may also find that in certain level brackets that this doesn't quite cover your tracery needs to fully fill out your 2 LIs, especially with traceries that you want for your character's specific spec and build. Outside of traceries, these quests will also occasionally contain enhancement runes as well. Another big source of traceries and enhancement runes is group content. If you run group content while leveling, this will be a great way to get additional traceries and round out your build. But this is actually a big part to boosting your LIs at the level cap with endgame content. Everything from 3-mans to 6-mans to raids will drop traceries and enhancement runes, with higher difficulties and higher difficulty tiers dropping higher quality items. In my experience, the reward structure is standardized dating back to at least Mordor instances at the level 115 cap. The Mordor expansion and its group content follows the same modern format as all the later expansions and level caps. So before Mordor, players have reported some more oddities in terms of LI loot, some of which are likely a result of the transition from the old LI system to the new system which launched in late 2021. There is one additional requirement to receive LI loot and instances. You must not be running an instance that is lower level than your character's level bracket. So for example here, a level 125 character will not get LI loot from a level 116 to 120 instance or below. Additionally, teal and gold tracery drops can only be gotten in instances at the level cap of the character's level bracket. So for that level 125 character, they would only get teal and gold drops in an instance that is set to level 130 or higher. On this note of oddities and transition from the old LI system, when the new system launched, quite a few older instances dropped heritage runes, but a lot of these have since been patched out. Now, I'm not familiar with every single boss loot and chest in every instance at every difficulty level, but it is possible that you will still find some heritage runes from group content. Just be aware that SSG, the developers, have been phasing out heritage runes, especially as easily farmable rewards from instances since the system transition. Either way, expect to see LI items in instances starting with Moria and scaled instances that are set to level 50 plus. That's what really matters here. The third source of LI system items that we have is bartering with reputation factions around the world of Middle-earth, again starting with Moria. While the exact items available for barter will depend on the specific faction, generally there are going to be tracery boxes, enhancement runes, and heritage runes available for barter. If you are leveling in LOTRO and find yourself either in want of some new LI stuff or just have an excess of reputation barter currencies, it is a good idea to go ahead and check the faction leaders and barter vendors to see if you can maybe get something useful for your LIs. Typically, these barters will offer rewards that are most relevant for the level of the faction. So for example here, the Western Gondor barter for the Dol Amroth faction offers level 86 traceries and enhancement runes, which are for the level 86 to 100 level bracket, which matches the level of the region, which is 95 to 100. The fourth source of LI system rewards is missions. Missions are almost like a hybrid between instances and quests, and you can run them solo or duo if you're not familiar with them. But the weekly missions quests will offer you the option between character rewards, crafting rewards, or LI rewards. The LI rewards box will give you a random teal tracery box and a box that lets you actually select between either 2 purple enhancement runes or a tracery reclamation scroll that can again be used to unslot all traceries on an LI. Outside of the selectable rewards, the weekly quests also offer a couple enhancement runes and some other useful things like Virtue XP, Modes of Enchantment for leveling characters, or Embers of Enchantment for max level characters. So you do get some non-LI related stuff that could be useful for you out of those as well. The fifth method is special for the level 140 cap and the Gundabad crafting tier, which includes crafting traceries. For an important note, crafting in LOTRO is getting overhauled over the next few months and on top of a new expansion with a new crafting tier in the level 150 cap. So it is likely that crafting traceries won't be exactly the same. However, this still sets the precedent of future level caps involving crafting as a source of traceries. So this is something to always be on the lookout for when you plan out how you want to acquire and get your traceries to get out your LIs. But for the Gundabad crafting tier right now, you can craft both Heraldries and Word of Craft traceries. And with this, the recipes are all one-time use and only certain crafting professions can craft certain traceries. The LOTRO wiki here has a great database on these traceries and which professions craft them. Huge shout out to their team, by the way, as you've probably seen it's been valuable for some visuals that have aided this video. Anyway, the recipe boxes can be gotten from the reward track and delvings, and they allow you to choose which specific recipe you want. Unlike most traceries, I should point out these are also tradable. For the Heraldries, these actually provide the exact same stats as their non-crafted counterparts. The big difference though is that these crafted Heraldries contribute to Word of Craft set bonuses, so crafted Heraldries are always going to be straight up better than non-crafted versions. For the Word of Craft traceries, these are actually unique traceries that are different than the non-crafted Word of Craft traceries. These have different effects such as decreased skill induction, threat modifiers, run speed boost, and so on as shown. Crafting these requires a little bit of Ancient Script barter currency that can be crit using normal optional crit ingredients. Another important thing with these Word of Craft crafted traceries is that they are unique use. You actually cannot use more than one of these traceries on your two LIs. That said, you can actually have two different quality levels of the same tracery type. So for example, there is a gold and teal version of the decreased skill induction. You could have one of the gold quality decreased skill induction on one of your LIs, and you could also have the teal quality on one of your LIs. It doesn't matter if they are on different LIs or the same ones, but that is how that currently functions. Those methods of obtaining traceries and enhancement runes are a great start, but they do not involve either the reward track or ancient scripts. Before we dive into the reward track, I'll go ahead and cover ancient scripts, which are the barter currency for the LI system. Ancient scripts are acquired mainly from the reward track actually, but are also acquired from disenchanting traceries that you do not want. To disenchant any disenchantable item in LOTRO, you need to right-click the Flame of Encalamir item in your inventory, and then you click the item you want to disenchant. Every character in LOTRO receives a Flame of Encalamir at the start of the game, but if you accidentally sold or destroyed yours, you can talk to an adventurer's or traveler's quartermaster, such as the ones found by the Boar Fountain and Bree here, to buy a new one. Disenchanting a tracery will give you a little bit of ancient script, but again, the bulk of the ancient scripts that you acquire will be from the reward track. Ancient scripts have a cap of 10,000, so you cannot infinitely hoard them as new expansions and level caps are added to the game. But something you might notice is that I and many other players are actually way over this 10,000 cap. Well, when the old LI system was converted to the new one, players who had old LIs could get a huge set of items to get started with the new system, including a ton of ancient scripts with a special system that basically allowed you to go over the cap for this transition. This is still technically possible today by bringing up the old LI panel and appraising your old LIs. I have a lot more details in my video dedicated to the transition to the new LI system. But from the old LI system, you may also disenchant old LI systems like Scrolls of Empowerment, Legacies, and other things for ancient scripts and sometimes traceries and enhancement runes. But setting all that aside, ancient scripts are very useful at the archive of traceries to straight up barter for specific traceries that you want. The first vendor here has a bunch of useful stuff, including every legendary item available to every class, including all weapon types, a map to the archive so you can quickly get back there, tracery reclamation scrolls, and enhancement runes up to teal quality from levels 50 to 121, then yellow quality for level 131, which is the current level cap bracket. Then, each of the bookshelves that you can interact with offer a set of traceries divided by the classes for Word of Mastery traceries. Then there's a bookshelf for Word of Power, there's one for Heraldric traceries, and then one for Word of Craft. From these barters, yellow and purple traceries can be bartered for with just ancient scripts. This is a super easy way to get a specific tracery you want, assuming you have enough ancient script. For teal and gold traceries, you will need a special shattered or cracked tracery barter item to make it a bit harder to get the best quality traceries. The shattered and cracked tracery tokens may be occasionally acquired from quests in the reward track, and technically loot boxes, but we ignore those. These tracery tokens have the same level range restrictions as normal slottable traceries. Still, bartering is the best way to ensure your allies have the exact tracery setup that you want. Typically, I only recommend worrying about bartering for traceries at the level cap and otherwise just using what you naturally get from playing the game while leveling. That said, if you do find your character lacking and there's a specific tracery, such as like single target damage or a certain class tracery that has a big impact for you, then you obviously have the freedom to barter for traceries in those scenarios whenever you want. Really, you just have to assess where your character is and what you want to do on them and decide if it's really worth bartering while leveling, and consider that you will potentially replace these traceries very soon afterwards. It's always possible that bartering for a few traceries while leveling will actually be worth it to you. The reward track here is the last piece of the LI reward system puzzle. The reward track progresses as you gain item XP on any character on your account, and more specifically per server again. So just as a brief example, as somebody who has played on both Landreval and the Arkenstone server, all my characters on Landreval have their own reward track, while all my characters on Arkenstone have their own reward track, and they don't have any sort of interaction cross-server. Anyway, the reward track itself offers 100 tiers of rewards. With each level you can claim a reward. Each reward may only be claimed once per account, but the rewards are account bound, so you can transfer them to other characters. After the first 100 levels of the reward track, there is a repeatable reward that is technically tier 101. This repeatable reward basically contains a random ally item, such as ancient scripts, enhancement runes, traceries, craft recipes, and so on. So if you play LOTRO a lot and get a ton of item XP, it will never go completely to waste with these random boxes at tier 101. The reward track is seasonal and has historically been on a 3-month rotation where every 3 months all progress is reset and there are new rewards available. It is important to note that every 25 levels there is usually a special reward that has typically been unique cosmetics exclusive to that particular reward track season. This also does mean that you can only get these cosmetics on one character, which is an important note for things like cosmetic pets, which cannot actually be transferred after use, unlike cosmetic armor. There are also occasionally some rewards that are not directly related to the ally system, with Embers of Enchantment, which is an endgame barter currency, for example. All rewards come in the form of boxes that need to be opened to get the actual items. And unlike a lot of quest rewards and instance loot, these boxes are not for a specific level. This means that these boxes that do not have a level in the item name and tooltip will give an item that is for your character's level bracket. So for example, my level 108 Guardian will receive a level 106 to 116 tracery from one of these tracery boxes. This does mean that you can save non-level specific tracery boxes for higher levels, and unless the developers implement something to prevent this, for future expansions and level caps as well. Ultimately, just like bartering, I actually recommend saving these boxes for the level cap, unless again you really want something specific out of them for your leveling character. Keep in mind though that these are entirely random, unlike directly bartering for traceries. As for enhancement rune boxes, I definitely recommend saving those for the level cap. As a heads up, this will require a lot of storage space if you're getting a lot of reward track rewards and saving them for the level cap or future expansions or whatever. For example, I have one storage alt that is basically 100% filled on LI related items, and honestly, I already need to make a second one just to hoard even more. As a final reminder, with the reward track being seasonal and resetting every 3 months, always be sure to at least claim the rewards before the season ends, otherwise they are permanently lost. Just to note, you do have to be on a character that has completed the Seeker of Deep Places deed to claim LI rewards and, again, to even contribute to the reward track with item XP in the first place. Speaking of item XP, our last item to cover is Heritage Runes, which grant item XP for the reward track. While these are not as common nowadays compared to the earlier days of the new LI system, you may still run into a few of these in your LOTRO adventures, especially as a barter reward for some reputation factions. There is actually a strategy to optimizing heritage runes rather than just using them when you get them. So first off, you may just want to save heritage runes for a reward track that has rewards that you really want and use them as a way to essentially ensure or guarantee you get those rewards. So with each season having at least 4 special cosmetics at levels 25, 50, 75, and 100, if you find some of those appeal to you, you could save your heritage runes for a season like that to make sure you get those cosmetics. Otherwise, you can really choose how you want to use your heritage runes. Personally, I am currently saving mine for the first reward track season of the new expansion coming later this year, at least from recording this video. The bigger strategy component to this comes in with what character and level you use your heritage runes on. So item XP does not progress the reward track by the same amount for characters at different levels. For example, 10,000 item XP at level 50 will progress the reward track a lot more than 10,000 item XP at level 100. The general idea of this is that doing the same content on the level 50 character will give the same progress as the same type of content on a level 100 character, so it normalizes the different XP gains at the 2 levels so that each character contributes the same amount to the reward track. This is an important concept for heritage runes, as you will want to use heritage runes on the lowest level character possible for the heritage runes minimum level requirement. So for level 45 heritage runes, a level 45 character is best and will give the most progress on the reward track. And even at this point, a character in the 50s is much better using them on than, say, like a level cap character. And this same idea applies to all the different minimum levels that heritage runes have. Obviously, making the most out of heritage runes would require a lot of alts at very specific levels. So if you just have a single character that you play LOTRO with and either don't have or are not interested in alts, this maybe won't apply to you as much, but it's still, I think, a good thing to keep in mind. And with that, we have covered the basics of the legendary item system, acquiring them, the LI system items and how to acquire those items and other LI rewards, as well as item XP and the reward track along with ancient scripts barter currency. The very short and sweet version of my personal LI strategy is to first make sure I reforge every 5 levels starting at 56, then to just not really bother too much trying to maximize my traceries while leveling. I also do not worry about enhancement runes, but I still use them when I get them, prioritizing first Heraldries, and then for the non-level specific LI boxes that I get, I will save those for endgame, and finally I save heritage runes for specific reward track seasons, and I use them on characters that I have closest to their minimum level. At the level cap, I am more willing to barter for a complete set of at least purple quality traceries to get the traceries that I want for my build, and I'm much more willing to open non-level specific reward boxes as well as to try to get good traceries and boost them to higher item levels with enhancement runes. Honestly, at the level cap, enhancement runes do make quite the difference in terms of the stats that tracers give and the ultimate stats that your allies give you. Just like virtues, it actually adds up really quickly. In fact, outside of virtues, I would argue that boosting your ally with good, high-quality tracers and enhancing the item level is far more important for medium and long-term progression at endgame than focusing on gear. The good news, though, is endgame content generally gives both ally rewards and gear rewards at the same time anyway. This section of the guide is dedicated to strategies and tips for building out your legendary items to get the most out of the system for your character. While you can only have 2 allies equipped at once, many players actually carry around more than 2. Typically, this is more frequent at the level cap for endgame group content, but even while leveling, you may find value in carrying an additional LI. Take this example. As a leveling guardian, you use a 2-handed weapon and your class item belt for both of your allies, but occasionally you run some dungeons as a tank. Well, you're going to want a shield to tank, meaning you need a 1-handed weapon. Thus, you would want to carry those 2 weapons for the 2 different builds. Even more, you may actually consider a separate class item belt for your tank build as well, especially at endgame. If the traceries on your original two-handed weapon and belt are optimized for DPS, then the traceries even on the belt will not be the best for tanking. Thus, to be fully optimal with your allies for both DPS and tanking, you would need 4 total, so that you have a set for DPS and a set for tanking. This basic idea extends to all classes. In general, for each trait tree specialization, it is best to have a set of 2 allies dedicated to that trait tree. That said, depending on the class and builds you run, there are of course exceptions, and there is actually great flexibility in the ally system. If we go back to that Guardian example, you may find that you can get a belt that works well enough for both tank and DPS. It may not be the best possible belt for tanking, and may not be the best possible for DPS, but that will save you an immense amount of time and resources in building and upgrading a whole additional LI. In this case, you would have a 2-handed weapon for DPS, a 1-handed weapon for tanking, and 1 belt for both. Another consideration is what you primarily play and what would help your gameplay out the most. What if on this Guardian, you tank a ton of dungeons and only play DPS on the landscape? In this scenario, you might consider a single belt that is optimized for tanking and just use that for your DPS builds as well. Sure, your DPS build won't be as good, but you will save the time and resources while maintaining an optimal tank experience. Assuming you are able to achieve your landscape goals and have no trouble without a belt built for DPS, then you should be completely fine with only the 2-handed weapons dedicated to DPS. You can also consider the opposite scenario where you do play tank but usually only run, say, like tier 1 content or whatever, like relatively low difficulty level, where you can actually get by with a DPS belt even as a tank. Well, if you spend a lot more time in the DPS spec and don't actually need a belt ally dedicated to tanking to be a successful tank in the content that you run, then you may just want to consider having that single DPS belt that you also use in your tank spec. Again, this whole idea extends to all other classes and build options. I cannot tell you what is best for you because we are all individual players with different goals in our LOTRO playtime. Some players may just go with a pure DPS build. Some may go full in on the tank and even use their one-handed weapon and shield when in a DPS spec on landscape. Other players may prefer to build out 2 separate LI sets. For an even crazier example, let's meet my Runekeeper. I don't really play him a ton nowadays, but he is at the level cap and I sometimes run group content on him, some solo delvings, and occasionally I'll run some other endgame content. Runekeeper is a bit interesting because it's one class where you could consider 5 or even 6 total LIs to be fully optimal with all 3 specializations. But I don't play my Runekeeper that much, so I don't actually have 6 LIs on him, even though I do bounce around between all 3 specs when I play him. I am also willing to admit here that his configuration with the 4 LIs is actually a bit of a mess, and even for me, not really optimized well. But the reason I show him and even share this is because it's a real character that is still progressing through the LI system at the level cap. I have not really spent any ancient script on getting specific traceries I want. I also haven't used many enhancement runes at all on him. Instead of opening LI reward boxes that I get on this character, I actually send them and funnel them to my Warden, who I play a whole lot more. The reason is I get a lot more value out of those on my Warden, and actually at this point I'm already saving everything for the new Umbar expansion anyway. But the result of all this is he has a couple sets of LIs that are honestly not in great shape, but very importantly, they are good enough. I saved myself a ton of stress by getting them into a serviceable shape, which is actually fairly easy with the new LI system compared to the old one, where it took a ton more grinding to get to this point. But I really do save myself a lot of stress by getting them to this good enough state. Now, I should point out that before the level 140 cap, my Fire Runestone, the set shown on the right here, used to be mixed for healing in Redline. That way I could essentially use my Yellow Line bag in combination with my Redline stone for the occasions that I would heal. For level 130, this was enough, and even at level 140, I can actually manage healing any of the instances that I have attempted to heal. So again, while my LIs are not set up almost at all for healing right now, I do good enough as a healer that I haven't had to stress about either changing my current setup or building new LIs dedicated to healing. And really the moral here is that the game is meant to be fun, not stressful. Consider what in LOTRO is fun to you and what you want to achieve out of your gameplay. While there is a lot to the LI system and a lot of room to make your character much more powerful with optimized and well-built LIs, if you are having fun and achieving your gameplay goals, then just don't fret too much about having bad or suboptimal LIs. If you are wanting to improve, then this guide and other resources that are tailored for builds that you play will then come in handy. The goal of this guide is to get you to that starting point for improvement and give you some specific ideas for specific traceries in a later section. Just like there is nothing wrong about having 4 sketchy LIs like my Runekeeper has, there's also nothing wrong about wanting to have the best possible LIs for your character. That's the approach that I tend to take on my Warden. For my Warden, the only restriction that I have personally set is that I more or less refuse to have over 2 LIs. It takes an inordinate amount of time to fully build out a single LI with high quality teal and gold traceries and fully enhance the tracery item levels to the cap, much less 4 LIs that it would take for me to have 2 separate LI sets dedicated to both tank and DPS builds I run. Still, given this restriction, I utilize all my resources that I have as efficiently as possible to create 2 LIs that work for what I do in the game. Lately, I have been having a lot more fun as a tank warden since the revamp in mid-2023. Prior to this revamp, I actually had 2 LIs dedicated to fully DPS, so they were fully optimal anyway. With the new expansion coming in late 2023, at this point it's just not worth the effort for me to build out 2 new LIs dedicated to tanking, or even just 1 LI if I could do some hybrid build. While it would be a lot more optimal for me to have the 2 sets of LIs with the 2 new ones for tanking and 2 of the old ones for DPS, the new LIs would be quite weak, as I won't be able to get a bunch of teal and gold traceries along with a ton of enhancement runes to put into them. And this type of thinking is what has allowed me to maximize my fun when I'm playing my Warden. It is just an example of the thinking that you can apply to your LOTRO gameplay. And for this character, I do want to provide more details on the actual LI traceries and why I have them. So first for the spear here, the Heraldry of the Swift Serpent, this is just the highest added heraldry that I have received at this point. AoE attack damage, it's not really terrible for extra oomph while tanking, and it also helps keep my landscape and group content DPS up. The AoE target account is good for hitting more targets with tanking, which can be important for aggro, as well as just more targets to get hit in the DPS spec. Shield line healing, this is more oriented towards healing, which I actually already used for survivability in the old DPS spec prior to the Warden revamp, but it shines in tanking. The next 2 are good for DPS, but again, that would make them ultimately help with threat and keep my damage output a little bit higher than it otherwise would be. The next 3 traceries I would actually use in both tanking and DPS builds anyway, as they just provide good general utility. Finally, both Ascendant Light traceries here give me that 15% light damage set bonus. Of course, this is more DPS oriented. Moving on to my Javelin here, I have Heraldry of the Ox. This is not really an optimal tracery, but it is the best that I have gotten. Obviously, I would rather the agility variant, but again, I'm just making the most out of what I actually have. After that, I have 2 damage over time traceries. Again, these aren't going to be oriented for extra damage. I do have the max morale multiplier tracery here as well, which is great for tanking, but also general survivability. I have another damage tracery here, and then 2 more traceries are going to be decent for utility, but they primarily are for improving my tanking capabilities. And then 1 more DPS tracery that actually only applies to a skill in the red line. So when I play blue line, for tanking, all this really offers is the crit rating stat. And then I do have 2 more tanking oriented traceries, and finally 2 heroic precision traceries for the 3% increased crit chance set bonus. So as you can see, these 2 LIs are built for hybrid tanking and DPS, but very importantly, they are good enough for all the content I run on my Warden, which includes high tier 3-mans as a tank even up to max difficulty tier 5, low to mid tier 6-mans and raids up to about tier 3. It also includes high tier delvings, specifically tier 7, which maximizes reward efficiency for delvings, Even soloing those in tank spec, the DPS traceries allow me to do so with decent speed, and I can even actually run tier 7 and DPS spec where the tankier traceries help with the survivability end of things, so I can focus on DPS and running the delving more quickly. And on top of all that, I do landscape content, including with the landscape difficulty system. The DPS traceries help a ton in the speed part of that, while the tanking traceries allow me to tank what I want to tank, which is, again, high tier 3 mans and any of the 6 or 12 mans that my kin runs. All that said, there is room for improvement with these LIs. I think the big eyesore of the Might Heraldry is an obvious one, but otherwise, these work for me and what I do, and I'll be able to reevaluate as I replace all my traceries with the new expansion anyway. So as you can hopefully see, LIs are not really black and white in what they are either like bad or they're good. You really do have to evaluate what makes sense for your character and how you play LOTRO, and actually what resources you even have in the first place. I hope these examples have given you maybe some food for thought and are helpful in deciding how you want to build your LIs out for your characters. Now that we have covered the LI system in detail, along with some background on building out LIs for your character, I do want to review the traceries available for Barter at the Archive of Traceries to give you all some idea of traceries that tend to be better and ones that maybe are not quite as ideal and typically have better alternatives. I will go over tracers for each class, but I'm not going to focus on, say, creating an LI build for each class, because again, that will heavily depend on what you want to achieve out of your character. And sometimes this can even vary greatly if you primarily play solo or primarily play group content. And if I did that, it would actually mean that this guide would be outdated very quickly, which is kind of the opposite of the goal of the guide, as there have been frequent balance changes with classes recently, as well as a lot of pending class updates and revamps going on, and a whole new expansion coming out, which could very easily change things, on top of which there is that crafting overhaul, which could even play a different role in crafting traceries than we have at the level 140 Gundabad crafting tier. But first off here, let's cover the Heraldries. So as I brought up in the crafting section of this video, the crafted Heraldries are always better than their non-crafted counterparts because they contribute to the Word of Craft set bonuses. All of the 2P set bonuses are very effective, but the optimal choice will come down to your specific build and how you utilize Word of Craft traceries. For example, on a Breadline Runekeeper, you can actually get both the lightning and fire damage set bonuses through 2 Heraldries and 2 Word of Craft traceries. Then you can get the crit chance set bonus from the precision Word of Craft traceries for 3 total set bonuses between 2 Heraldries and 4 Word of Craft traceries. Similarly, on a DPS Warden build, you could utilize these to get the crit chance set bonus, tactical mitigation set bonus, and light type damage set bonus. And to highlight the flexibility with these, you could even go for the attack duration set bonus instead of tactical mitigation if you want more of a glass cannon choice. Not all classes and builds will necessarily want to use 3 set bonuses like this, but it is something to keep in mind when planning out your heraldries and even your Word of Craft traceries. And before we get into more details on these Word of Craft traceries, for general heraldry recommendations, typically the ones that are called defensive are better than the offensive counterparts that have the same stats. This is because the stat value of the defensive ones are a little bit better, where you just get overall more useful stats for your character. This does mean that on a DPS Warden or on a Hunter for agility examples, the Sparrow Heraldries are even better than the Serpent Heraldries. If you are curious why this is the case, the short answer is that main stats are just not very efficient, and the defensive Heraldries have quite a bit more vitality than the offensive ones, and they give up comparatively little mastery. It's actually the same concept with virtue traits. As a final note, while leveling, you'll want to follow the same priority for heraldries if you have the option. For Word of Craft traceries, these follow that same idea with set bonuses. Your highest priority should be filling the set bonus that you want, which will most commonly be the 2-piece set bonuses because again, they affect percentages rather than raw stats. As I covered in my stat guide, that's important because it allows you to go over caps, and honestly, a lot of set bonuses are large boosts anyway. That said, there are quite a few specs and builds in the game that may only need 2 set bonuses, leaving 2 Word of Craft traceries to pad stats. This is where the unique crafted Word of Craft traceries comes into play. With their unique sets, you will find that while these traceries don't actually have set bonuses attached to them, they may still be better than any alternatives for your character. Importantly, these are unique, unlike the other Word of Craft traceries, meaning you can only have one slotted between your 2 allies. However, that unique use applies to the specific rarity or quality level as well, so you can use a teal and gold version of the same tracery. For example, on a Redline Hunter, you will probably find a lot of value in both the gold and teal focus tracery that reduces skill inductions. After prioritizing for set bonuses and deciding if you want any crafted Word of Craft traceries, or just depending on what you actually have to use, not like living in a dream world of always having the absolute best options available, really it comes down to what stats you want. While mastery is generally going to be the highest priority stat, depending on your class and build, critical rating traceries will provide more long-term value, as mastery is much easier to cap than crit rating. Of course, while leveling, you'll just want to use the best option, which very well could be mastery traceries. My stats guide has more details on how you can weight crit rating versus mastery for your character, but I do have 2 more notes for Word of Craft traceries. First, the non-set bonus traceries offer the same stats as the set bonus version, so they're always a worse option. Second, just like with gear, virtues, and so on, block, parry, and evade, or BPE traceries are not useful. Honestly, for the BPE traceries, I would recommend not even ever slotting them over nothing and just disenchanting them for Ancient Script instead. The Word of Power and Mastery traceries are a lot more complex with their huge flexibility in how you can tailor them to your specific build for how you play the game. I already touched a little bit on hybrid builds and some comparisons between group-oriented and solo builds, and maybe even trying to get something suitable for both. Essentially, the way this section is going to work, I am going to go through the Word of Power traceries, highlighting potential uses of them and also highlighting or lowlighting the less useful ones. The following Word of Mastery section will follow the same format, and the goal here is to provide you with the information necessary for you to make a good choice for your character and build. A lot of these are straightforward, with something like the increased AoE damage and then the one for AoE crit chance and magnitude, since those are fairly self-explanatory and that you'd want to use them to boost your AoE effectiveness. I'll be skipping past most traceries like that unless there is something to note about them. Also, we will go ahead and look at the gold quality traceries so we can see them at their full effectiveness. So moving on past the AoE traceries, the first special one that we get to is Area Effect Target Count, which increases the amount of enemies that are hit by your AoE. So while it does not directly increase your AoE damage, it can allow you to hit more enemies, which could result in a substantial DPS boost if you are fighting enemies where you take advantage of this tracery. So you may want to consider it in those scenarios. Even as a tank, it could be useful for your AoEs to help you aggro more enemies than you otherwise would normally be able to. There's also another interesting situation for classes with AoEs that don't hit that many targets. If you are, for example, playing a Redline Burglar that is not spec'd for the single target trait, and you do have your AoE still, then you could consider this tracery to greatly increase the amount of targets that are hit by those. So you have a lot of considerations like that when considering a tracery that's almost like a utility tracery, like Area Effect Target Count. Moving on, we have base morale multiplier as well, and I should point out the tooltip for this tracery is unfortunately bugged where it says ×1 maximum morale. For this tracery, which is plus 5.5%, it's actually multiplicative, it's a multiplier, so that should read ×1.055 maximum morale, giving you a little bit over 5% extra. Also for this tracery, I think it's obviously a good one for tanking, but it's also good for general survivability even on a DPS character if you want the increased survivability, or even maybe a support role character. Also, just like I talked about with the other traceries, all the BPE ones, so block, evade, parry, are going to be useless, and you should ideally never have those. And we see that there are damage over time and healing over time traceries here, but I do want to highlight the damage over time criticals. A hidden mechanic in LOTRO is that some damage over time effects actually cannot trigger a critical hit, so there is no chance for them to crit and they never do critical damage. Unfortunately, the game is not very clear on which damage over time abilities can and cannot crit, but I thought I would point that out. You will basically have to find out for your specific class and abilities that you're using if they actually can trigger a crit, because if they can't trigger a crit, then you may not actually want to consider this if you otherwise were. But moving on from that one, I did want to point out for tanking, another valuable one is actually going to be incoming heal bonus over all these PPE ones, just as an example. Moving on to the second page, the next tracery of highlight is going to be another defensive one with incoming damage reduction. There's this physical version way up here, and then down here there is the tactical version. So one decreases tactical damage, the other decreases physical or melee and range damage. These are obviously good for tanking and survivability, but if you're, say, a character that only has one choice for survivability, then typically the morale multiplier is going to be better. Moving on though, we have another interesting tracery with ranged attack extension. This is another example of one that does not directly boost your DPS. But there are situations, perhaps if you're doing PvP content or even just on landscape content, where this could be a huge enough quality of life boost that you want this tracer even though it doesn't directly increase your damage. This is not necessarily a recommendation, but I have also seen some tanks pick this tracery so they can use their taunts from farther away. And for the ranged healing extension here, that's going to be pretty similar. And then for the skill induction speed, just to point out for anybody curious, that is only for abilities that actually have an induction, like on the Warden here, Ambush has a 1.5 second induction, and normal abilities have an animation that is not an induction, just to clarify for anybody that is unfamiliar with that. So this type of tracer would be most effective on a class that has a lot of inductions that you want to speed up. And finally, for the skill power cost, this one I have not really found much of a use for, even with the power revamp, but if you're constantly running out of power and maybe want to lessen that a little bit, that would be the situation you could consider this, but I have not ever seen anyone actually want to use this. So for the class traceries here, I'm again going to look at the level 50 versions just for the simplified stats, so we're not too distracted by that, but they are actually organized in the tracery archive by their different uses. So we have like general damage, general utility for the Beorning here, and then the hide, the claw, the roar. So we'll take a look at each of these individual sections, and I'm going to again focus on the gold, but you can see all the different qualities here to see the different effects they provide, such as barrier form damage, which I already went over way earlier in this video, goes up to 22% at gold and is 16% at yellow. Either way, a lot of the clash traceries, like the role traceries, are fairly straightforward in that you'd want bear form and beast form damage for increased DPS with your Beorning. Same with man form there, relentless maul damage. Roar damage I haven't found to be quite as useful with the Beorning compared to other damage options, but at high levels you do have a lot of tracery slots. Slam damage and bonus wrath chance is fairly similar, but I should point out that the Beorning is actually getting a revamp relatively soon after recording this video. So that's why, again, I'm not focusing too much on these and just pointing out any interesting things. Vigilant roar damage at the moment, this is another example of an ability that you ideally wouldn't be using too much in a DPS rotation, and impacting its damage is not the most impactful. And that type of thinking is how you'd really create a build for your character. Do you use something like Vigilant Roar very often on your Beorning? Well, if not, then you probably don't want a tracery to boost its damage. Moving on though, for the general utility here, the Bee Swarm crit defense debuff, definitely useful. That'd pretty much be useful in all situations playing a Beorning, and it's actually pretty similar here with the dot pulses and swarm debuff duration because of the massive amount of support that you get with Bee Swarm. Definitely worth increasing the damage on that, as well as damage over time pulses. That has a great combination of effects, more than just one. Now, counter dodge chance, which is going to actually be evade bonus and attack damage, that is an example of a tank tracery that is not really the most impactful, and I would often find tanking on a Beorning that I'd rather something else typically. Similarly, a tracery like this with the rush evasion bonus and duration mainly would want to use that for the increased rush duration, so you can have increased run speed for a little bit longer in combat, but that's not really something that I would actually want out of my Beorning. But again, you may be different. Shake Free cooldown is an actually great example of a utility tracery that you could consider. Not only does it give vitality, which is typically a high value stat for even class and word of power traceries like this, but also being able to use your stun removal ability more frequently can be helpful. And finally, this one's pretty straightforward in that you can refund some wrath after using a spender, so this is helpful to increase your wrath amount on a Beorning. As we move into the hide here, this is going to be the tank spec, so it should have a lot of tanking oriented traceries that ideally you would want on a blue line Beorning. You have something like recuperate pulses for more healing, thickened hide duration and tactical damage reduction, good for that cooldown, thunderous roar cooldown to use that taunt more frequently, and finally vigilant roar incoming healing buff. All of those do have decent consideration for a tanking Beorning. Moving on to the claw, these are a little bit more specific for redline. I will point out execute is one that's getting a revamp right now that is the opposite of a worthy tracery and very terrible because execute is terrible, but that will likely change in the future. Call to Wild melee damage, definitely very useful for that cooldown. Same with all these ones that impact abilities you use frequently, so thrash damage, turn the tide's probably not worth using at this point, but it's the type of thing that could change in the revamp. For the roar with your healing, it looks like pretty much all of these are ones that you could definitely consider to increase your healing output ultimately. For brawlers, they have 6 different sections here for general buffs, damage, strength, and then for the 3 specializations. Melee range can be a nice quality of life boost. It's not the largest range boost at less than 1 meter for all your attacks, but you can attack from farther away from that. Ignore pain, reducing the cooldown and increasing the amount of debuffs that you can dispel with that. Definitely could be a good quality of life and utility boost. Similarly with your Joy of Battle cooldown and effect, that one could definitely be useful. One for all cooldown as well, and then quick feint cooldown and evasion buff could definitely be useful to use that more frequently. These are very straightforward, but a lot of them do have their uses. Now for more general damage, this is probably stuff you'd want more so for the DPS redline spec, but get increased target count with backhand clout, as well as increased damage with that. Basic attack damage for your setup skill damage, and then finishing attack damage. That would be an example of, depending on how many tracery slots you have, typically your finishers are going to be your highest damage source. So if you had to like pick and choose between just these two as an example scenario here, especially like in the leveling situation when you don't have many tracery slots, typically the finishing skills would be an example of one that's more useful and higher priority. You also get another cooldown reduction with Fulgurant Strike and increased damage with that. Useful, and then the get serious duration and damage buff, definitely useful as well. Moving on to the next page, Helm Crusher cooldown. This one you could use more frequently with this, but you might have to decide if you actually use Helm Crusher frequently enough that the reduced cooldown on that would be useful. Primarily, you could get the stun effect out of it more frequently. I also think Hurl Object is a great one to point out, where in solo landscape gameplay, you might actually find this to be a lot more useful than a group build brawler would find it, because it's not going to be a big DPS boost by picking it, but it could be great for allowing you to just go about the landscape faster. And as much as I love the animation of Mighty Upheaval, it's kind of similar to the Helm Crusher tracery, where it's just not going to be the most impactful outside of its actual use, which is going to be the knockdown rather than the AoE damage. In my experience, the innate strengths here are not going to be the most impactful for you, but you might consider them depending on where your character is and how much you get use out of the different innate strengths. But there's the criticals and mitigation one, then the damage and threat one, and finally the finesse and avoidance one. Now, innate strength skill cooldowns, on the other hand, can be great to allow you to more frequently use your builders and have a little bit faster gameplay loop on the Brawler. Moving on for the tanking traceries, that is going to be the fulcrum here. You have a lot of tracers that are more oriented towards that here. For the red line, this is going to include a lot of better tracers for improving your DPS with something like Fist of the Valar cooldown, which would definitely be a high priority red line brawler tracery. Then you have other damage boosting ones like Latent Light proc chance and damage. And then you do have the Shattering Fist armor debuff and damage. This one can be great to improve a little bit of the support aspect of your DPS brawler with increasing the debuff magnitude on that, as well as the bit of damage boost. Now in the yellow line, you have something with Battle-Wise Metal Chance, which could definitely be effective at increasing your metal generation, and then your Share Skills cooldown, very great for group support to share your buffs. That's one that would have a lot less usefulness if you were playing solo, for example. For Burglar Traceries, it starts off pretty straightforward in that you have a lot of general damage traceries to start, so if you're in these situations and want to boost the damage of these different skill types and the such, they're definitely effective for that. So you have like backstab damage, which might be harder to get use out of if you are playing solo, just as a heads up. Also, crit response skill damage would be a very high value one, as well as cunning attack bleed damage. And then purge corruption damage, in my experience, that's the type of tracery that you just wouldn't really get the most effect and benefit out of it because it's not the strongest ability, and its primary use is to remove corruptions, not deal a whole bunch of damage. That said, for Purge Corruption, if you don't find much of a better option for damage and you do use your corruption removal often and it ends up high on your damage abilities list, then there definitely is a situation where you could want that. For Subtle Stab, you have increased damage and crit multiplier, and then it looks like Surprise Strike has a couple traceries for it as well. And then it looks like the general utility ones also start straightforward with the Addle Tactical Damage debuff. If you want that type of effect, then you have that tracery. Chain Skill Critical Multiplier, definitely a high value one for damage, as well as Chain Skill Crit Chance. These are again being percentages that would bypass any sort of cap that critical rating would give you, and typically those type of things tend to be very valuable. Moving on, you get the increased debuff from Reveal Weakness and Riddle Range, which would be more of a utility quality of life type tracery rather than much of a direct impact. And finally, the last one here is if you want to move faster and stealth. Type of thing I wouldn't really consider for normally like improving my DPS or my support effectiveness on a burglar, but you know, if the situation calls for it where you want that specific effect, there's a tracery for it. Moving on, for the blue line traceries, we have a lot of things that directly impact the blue line with like all-in melee damage, gamble upgrade, both chance and damage here, and just a lot of different damage boosts. On the second page, there is also Lucky Strike Crit Chance, which gives you 11%, which is quite a high value there. For the red line, it's also pretty straightforward, as a lot of these have been. You have Feint Attack damage, and then also a couple for Coup de Grace, Duration, and Crit Chance. I also think this is a great time to compare something that does give you, at this case, 11% increased crit chance versus a tracery that gives you 55% increased damage. That extra 11% crit chance in the long run is actually much weaker than the huge boost to 55% increased damage. So if you had to choose between these two, the coup de grace damage would be more directly useful than the crit chance. And finally, for the yellow line, you have a lot of traceries that, if you can imagine, impact the yellow line. This includes a lot of, as a support spec with a lot of utility, a lot of different utility things here as well. And finally, one of the perhaps more immediately obviously useful ones would be something like increased tricks duration. For captains, we start out with a few traceries that impact your buffs, which includes the Battle Hardened state and Battle Ready state here to start, increasing the effectiveness of those two states. I do know that the Battle Ready damage buff is very significant if you are on a DPS captain. And then you also have something like Muster Courage Fear Resist, which if you want that specific effect, it's the type of thing that you can choose for that, but you're likely going to find other higher value things. Similar with Make Haste Duration, this is a tracery that it has that very specific use of increasing the duration of your run speed buff, but when do you really need, like in regular combat, that increased run speed buff? Those are the type of questions that I tend to ask myself and are ultimately what leads to creating a perhaps more optimized LI compared to a less optimized LI. For damage, you have a lot of stuff that directly impacts damage here with both Devastating Blow and Pressing Attack, crit chance, and damage. You also have Blade of Elendil damage, bleed pulses, which would be very valuable, I know, on a DPS captain nowadays, cutting attack damage, and finally I think Grave Wound damage and Inspire damage here. Finally, Sure Strike damage and Routing Cry damage, and then Battle Shout damage. Now, a lot of these that affect single abilities that don't do the most damage on their own, like Battle Shout, Sure Strike, and even Inspire, those are perhaps lower priority traceries, but if you are higher level, have a lot of tracery slots, and can fit all these damage ones in your allies, then you do have options for all these, but this is really when you have to compare, like if you say have one tracery left over and it just happens to be Battle Shout and Sure Strike would be your last two options that you have to compare how much you use those two abilities and how much upgrading their damage would actually impact you. Moving on though, for the blue line, there's a lot of different healing ones here with vocal skills, melee skills, valiant strike healing, rallying cry healing. The rallying cry healing could be a good general support one as well for the other specs. Then you also have words of courage healing, shield of the Dunedain duration for that buff, and finally the incoming healing on that same ability. For Lead the Charge, this is going to be the red line captain and a lot of stuff that impacts your damage with, well, actually two things with time of need buff duration there, which is only useful if you're actually playing a red line captain and have that trait. And then Shadow's Lament, which is also specifically red line. Moving on for a yellow line, you have stuff for tanking like Last Hand, Teal, increased potency on your Noble Mark debuff, and other tank related things. For champion, you have a few general utility traceries here. If you need some extra healing from bracing attack, that is what you start with, but it's not a huge bonus, I will point out. And then you have for Fear Nothing, the reduced cooldown on that and increased incoming healing with that. And moving on for Phyton, you have increase for the crit chance buff on that. And then one to actually point out that's maybe not the most effective in general damage scenarios is something like the sprint duration here and the evade chance during it. If you do want the increased duration on your run speed buff, you can definitely pick that tracery, but for general gameplay, might not find the most uses out of it. Now for general damage, this is probably going to have a mix of AoE and single target stuff, but Blade Wall, a very strong ability already, increasing the damage on that. For Feral and Savage Strikes, this is typically primarily used for the corruption removal aspect, so you might not find quite as much value out of this tracery, for example. Similarly, Hamstring for the damage and duration on that, it's mainly used, if I remember correctly, this is a slow. So with that, you might not find the most use out of it. For Horn of Gondor, the mitigation debuff is definitely effective on that if you're playing a yellow line champion. The damage component of that sort of just goes along with that. It's probably not the most impactful damage thing, but because of the mitigation debuff, that definitely makes it worth it. Merciful Strike damage, that ability is not very useful at the current moment with the champion, so you might want to avoid that one. Moving on, if you have power issues and have room for the tracer, you could consider Swift Strike and Blade damage and power restore. It does also increase the damage though, so you might want it for that anyway, and then wild attack damage. For blue line, you will have a lot of stuff impacting, it looks like, a lot of your cooldowns as well as riposte damage. If you get a lot of damage value out of riposte, you could always consider that, but if you are tanking, your primary job is not necessarily to do damage, and even if you pick this trait in the red or yellow line, it doesn't do a ton of damage on its own, mainly be used in certain solo situations for animation cancels, and typically at endgame builds you want to even end up picking this anyway, so I did want to point that out, that it's probably not as useful of a tracery. But in certain situations, you could find that use out of it. Moving on for the red line, we have a lot of things impacting our strike abilities. If you do use Ebbing Ire, you also have a tracery that impacts that, but that's not likely going to be one that you are going to want to pick. And then Ferocious Strikes damage and cooldown, Remorseless Strike damage, all useful stuff. For yellow line traceries, you have Battle Frenzy cooldown to use that more frequently. You could consider that for both blue and red line champions as well. You also have Exchange of Blows melee damage. I would anticipate that being mainly a useful one if you are running so low where you're actually taking damage and getting use of the Exchange of Blows effect, but even then, depending on how much damage it contributes for you, might not be worth picking at all. You also have Fury of Blades, Great Cleave, and Raging Blade traceries. And finally, another one to point out the usefulness is with Rend mitigation reduction, that does increase the support aspect of that ability with the debuff, so it can definitely be valuable for that on top of the damage it boosts. For Guardian, we start out with general buffs, which includes Catch a Breath, cooldown, and heal if you want that effect. You also have charge duration and speed. While that could definitely be an entertaining tracery just like a lot of the other speed ones, this may not have a bunch of direct uses for you in terms of boosting your damage. You also have more oriented towards tanking, Force Taunt duration here, and some quality of life boost with Guardian's Ward to increase the duration of that, as well as the block chance buff that it provides, and then another utility one to get you out of stuns, so your stun removal reducing the cooldown on that could be good utility for your character. Warrior's Heart duration buff here, as well as one that increases the heal and maximum morale buff that it provides. For general damage, you do have some that are only impactful if you're using a shield, which at that point you might consider other alternatives before you get something that actually boosts your damage with a shield, because generally when you're using a shield on your Guardian, you're focused more on defenses and tanking, where this would be a fairly low priority tracery compared to other ones, just to point out. But you also have Guardian's Ward damage. You do get the extra parry chance with that, but another question you should ask yourself is, does Guardian's Ward contribute enough damage where you could consider that tracery? For parry response damage, that's probably going to be more useful for the Guardian. This also reminds me a little bit late into this. Guardian is in the line to get a class revamp at some point in the year of releasing this video. So some of these could be a little bit different, and this is potentially one that could look different, but we do not know yet. Shield damage, just like with Bash, this is a lot more general utility, general usefulness, I should say, in that it impacts a lot more abilities than just Bash, but you have to consider, is boosting your shield damage really going to be worth it for you? Then you have stagger crit chance and duration on that effect. Stamp cooldown and damage. Stamp, this is very useful to reduce the cooldown on an interrupt, not just in group content, but even if you're just playing solo and not even needing to interrupt enemies, this can be very valuable for the animation cancel effect you can get with Stamp. You also have sting damage and critical chance. Sting, very strong filler for the Guardian and using that frequently. And then a couple straightforward ones for your sweeping cut and vexing blow effects, and also whirling retaliation damage there, although that's probably going to change in the Guardian revamp, that tracery, because the current setup with the Guardian revamp is changing retaliation and whirling retaliation, but you might not necessarily want this one if you have better options as a DPS Guardian. For tanking, you have a lot of stuff that impacts your blue line Guardian here with pledge cooldown, adaptability block, and parry rating, which does increase the actual chance. And then you also have for Guardian's Pledge, the cooldown and magnitude on that. You have another damage one that, again, you really have to ask, can you get something else that's more useful than boosting the damage of Shield Smash that's more directly impactful for your tanking. And then you also have another one for Warrior's Heart. For the Keen Blade, the red line, you have more damage impacting stuff like Brutal Assault, Overwhelm damage, and criticals into the King damage. And finally, for the yellow line, this is going to be a little bit more tanking oriented again, with some BPE increase from protection. It's only 1.1%, which really isn't a ton. And then you also have War Chant duration for that debuff. That is it for the Guardian, it looks like. For Hunter, there are a lot of damage impacting traceries as a primarily DPS class, kind of like Champion, but you have Focus Bow Critical Multiplier for abilities that consume focus. You have similar ones for your Induction Bow abilities. You also have specific here for Merciful Shot, the cooldown on that, and Crit Multiplier. The critical magnitude on Precision is definitely a useful one. Even if you're playing Redline Hunter, it's great to be in the Precision stance, so getting a tracery like that is good for both of those, both red and blue line, I mean. Another one that highlights the usefulness of Precision stance is going to be the Quick Shot critical chance and magnitude here as well. Then you have a couple other ones for quick shot damage. Now the Strength stance damage one is going to be less useful overall, because again, in most Hunter lines, you will typically prefer Precision over Strength, at least at higher levels when you have a lot of trait points and a lot of these traceries. I will point out at lower levels you might find a bit more use out of the Strength stance, but that's probably going to start changing around the transition of when you get your LI anyway. But you can always consider this. If you play mostly in Strength stance, you can boost your damage in that. Also have Swift Bow damage there. For general utility, these are probably typically going to be more useful for either survivability or in landscape, or if you need to do some crowd control in group content. You have Beneath Notice cooldown, Cry of the Hunter, Bubble Strength. That's probably not going to be the most impactful one, but if you really want solo survivability, that would be the case that you could consider something like that. Distracting Shot if you need that crowd control a little bit more frequently, that's when it'd be useful. Now the ranged attack, evade, and block chance, ideally you would have enough finesse where that doesn't even matter and you wouldn't want to use this tracery anyway. And then this one impacts only strength stance with quick shot and focus chance. Again, not wanting to be in the strength stance, this isn't going to be the most effective tracery. For blue line, we have barrage damage, as well as for a little bit more survivability in self-healing, you have the press onward cooldown reduction and increased healing magnitude out of that. You also have strength of the earth morale regen. Both of these are ones I typically only consider for survivability and probably wouldn't typically use strength of the earth morale regen. For the red line, you have burn hot damage as well as Heartseeker damage. It definitely could be useful, both of those, if you're playing the blue line and actually have the traits for that. For needful haste duration, I would anticipate you don't get the most benefit from that compared to a lot of other traceries. For AoE, you have Rain of Arrows, but if you're never at all in an AoE situation, that would be the time you'd consider not having that tracery, perhaps. Typically, though, it's hard to avoid ever having an AoE situation, so that's the type of thing you normally want to use. And then you have upshot damage. For yellow line, you have explosive arrow damage, lingering wound damage, and trap damage. Very straightforward for boosting yellow line stuff if you do play yellow line hunter. Lore Master is another class that is slated to get a revamp here soon, but we start off with Burning Embers critical chance and multiplier, so both of these impact Burning Embers, and then Cracked Earth, if you use that a lot, pretty big damage boost on that. Similar with Gust of Wind, and as well as your lightning skills here. A lot of these are going to be more oriented so far towards DPS role and Lore Master, and Light of the Rising Dawn is probably one that you typically not use the most frequently, but you could get value out of the tracery to give it quite a significant boost here. Pet attack duration, well, unfortunately pets are not that useful right now, but that's something that could change with the revamp, and this tracery might actually become useful again, but right now, definitely not worth considering. Staff strike damage, that's the type of one you have to ask yourself, do you happen to use Staff Strike a lot on your Lore Master? And if the answer is yes, and it actually contributes a lot of meaningful damage, you could consider it, but I would anticipate in most situations for most people, you would not want a tracery like that. You also have Sticky Gourd direct damage, and with the target resist chance versus damaging skills, ideally you would have enough finesse where this does not matter. All that said, because the only impact that enemies would have on you is to resist you because you are using spells, this is actually a situation where you could lower the amount of finesse you need by choosing this tracery. So unlike a lot of other ones like this for other classes, you could actually consider this on your Lore Master and then just not need as much finesse and other sources from your virtues, gear, and whatever else. Just something to consider with this one. But moving on, for general utility, you have increased armor debuff potency. Pet morale is not going to be one of the most useful right now. If you find yourself restoring a lot of power and want the increased magnitude on that, you could consider that with power restore here. But again, I haven't found many situations where power restoring is that necessary. Also a little bit increased effectiveness to some of your debuffs here, as well as target resistance for these abilities as well. For blue line, it looks like there is one tracery, which is going to be Inner Flame base healing. Probably wouldn't typically use that and would ideally find other useful traceries, but again, that's the type of thing that will likely change in the revamp. For red line, a little bit more DPS impacting traceries with Insco to War, you have Lightning Storm, and then just general Nature's Fury. Skill damage, as well as Ring of Fire damage here at the end. For Ancient Master, the yellow line can increase the healing magnitude of Beacon of Hope, get increased damage from charged air, the reflect from that. Just like with some of the other classes, you would have to actually consider if this does enough damage where it's actually useful to pick that tracery. There's also increased magnitude for one of your debuffs, Fire Lore. You also have Storm Lore damage, which I anticipate wouldn't be used all that much by any Lore Master line because the main effect of that is the AoE stun. And then you also have Test of Will damage and Devastate multiplier. Another example of one you have to consider, does that actually contribute damage where you'd actually want that tracery? For Runekeeper, we start off with some utility traceries here, and then we just have one for each of the lines there. But for self-motivation cooldown and power restore, you could definitely consider this for that utility effect and perhaps increased healing. Typically, I'd probably want this most often if I'm running solo compared to group content. Do Not Fall This Day cooldown is almost the opposite, where this is hugely impactful in group because you can effectively have 2 in-combat reses with your Runekeeper by applying Do Not Fall to allies, and with the decreased cooldown you can maintain 2 of those. So that's a hugely impactful tracer if you are running group content. You also have Runestone healing and damage, which in normal Runekeeper situations I would typically not consider that worth picking for either the damage or healing. But this is a situation where if you're running with landscape difficulty, higher tiers of that, the Runestone actually contributes a lot, and you could definitely consider this tracery if that is what you primarily do in the game. Again, you could measure your Runestone's effectiveness and see if boosting the healing and damage would actually have a good impact for your character though. For Chill of Winter debuff duration and the Flurry of Words incoming crit chance, this can be good for group support. Typically in solo content you probably won't get the most effectiveness out of it, but as some utility in group content with mainly the Flurry of Words incoming crit chance, it's definitely worth considering. And then target Chill of Winter resist chance, not going to be the most impactful. Finally, for Chilling Retort cooldown, that's the type of thing if you use that ability and want the decreased cooldown on that, the tracery is here, but it's not really going to be the most effective of traceries. Moving on for the blue line, you have a lot of different things for healing here, but I actually do want to point out right away, Word of Exaltation can be good for some survivability and just self-utility, even if you're playing one of the DPS specs. So that is something for you to consider. And then you have a little bit more directly healing related traceries with Writ of Health Healing, Bombastic Inspiration, Mending Verse, Epic for the Ages. And then finally, moving on to the last page is going to be the Preluto Power Restore. Just like all the other classes with power impacting abilities, even with the power revamp recently, I haven't found the most usages out of these and haven't seen many people wanting traceries like this, but it's something you can consider if you want that specific effect and you have the tracery slot open. Moving on for Redline, a lot of stuff that directly impacts our fire abilities here, all the way through Combustion at the bottom here, and finally Distracting Flame cooldown and increased damage on that. And then overall, Wrath of Fire resist chance, probably not going to be the most effective tracery. For Lightning, it's pretty similar, some general Fury of Storm impacts, as well as Epic Conclusion, Vivid Imagery, Ceaseless Argument here, Scribe Spark, and finally they do have a resist chance 1 themselves as well. Typically not going to be as effective. Again, ideally you have enough finesse where this doesn't really matter anyway. Then you also do have a couple other ones here with Sustaining Bolt, Shocking Words, and finally Shocking Touch resist chance, another example of one that's not overall going to be the most effective. And finally, we are on the last class with the Warden. There are 4 pages for them, so we start off with damage traceries, which include Spear Gambit initial damage here. You also have Spear Fist Gambit damage, and then Spear Shield Gambit damage. This is the type of one where it pretty much impacts your upfront damage, so you have to consider if you're using a lot of upfront damage abilities. Perhaps in longer duration fights and group content, you would find less use out of that. And it's actually the same here with the Spear Fist Gambit damage and regular Spear Gambit damage. All these are more upfront initial damage traceries. And then for Fist Gambit damage and crit chance, these do actually impact the overtime component. So if you're in a lot of longer fights and use your Fist Gambits, then these are definitely worth considering for that. You have Fist Shield and then Fist General as well there. And you also have Fist Spear for your damage over time. And then a less useful one for damage is going to be the Gambit Builder damage. On Warden, ideally you're doing most of your damage with your Gambits and not your Gambit Builders. And then for Recklessness duration, this is exclusive actually to the Redline, even though it's in general damage here. So this one's really only useful if you are playing a Redline Warden to increase the duration of that buff. Moving on to defense, probably a little bit more tanking oriented stuff here. We start off with morale tap damage and healing. Great to boost those if you use your morale taps. Resolution's actually very similar in that it is a morale tap and it's damage and healing, but this only impacts that one ability. So this is the type of example, this is a lot more universally applicable, so it's a lot more useful than the resolution tracery. Moving on, you have morale tap resist reduction, which is not very effective because you'd rather just have your finesse where that's not a worry with any of your abilities. And then you have shield gambit line healing, great for healing. You also have heal bonus for conviction there. A little bit more oriented specifically for tanking here, especially as restorative shield work cooldown. Very nice tracery to have for tanking, as well as shield gambit buff duration. Very nice quality of life, so you don't have to apply those as frequently. If you are maybe you're in a solo situation where you just play blue line Warden for, say, the base defenses that it gives you, and you don't actually ever use the Shield Gambit buffs, even though they are technically useful, this is a situation where you might not actually want this tracer, even though, like, generally it's the type of tracer that I personally would run on my Warden. There are situations where it might just not fit for you, and I think that's a good example to highlight here. Another useful one, tanking with shield tactics immunity duration. Defiant challenge damage return is another interesting one because you probably won't notice it as a big damage contributor at high levels, but depending on your measurements, you could consider it in those situations, but it actually does a lot of damage at low levels where it might be more worth considering if you have the option while leveling compared to, say, in other situations. And finally, some good utility with Never Surrender, increasing the duration and healing of that. Finally, for utility, one of the most useful traceries in the entire game, I'd put it on the levels of actually the Runekeeper's Do Not Fall This Day with decreased Warden Mastery cooldown, the best Warden tracery, I would say by a long shot just because of its huge effectiveness. And then you also have reduced cooldown for Steadfast, which is your stun removal ability. Good general utility to be able to use that more frequently, as well as the high value vitality stat with it. Then you have increased debuff magnitude for your marked and diminished target debuffs, and then increased gambit debuff duration, and then increased Way of the Spear bonuses. Typically, I don't get the most use out of this one. If I actually ever use that ability, it's typically going to be for the fist bonuses, but you might find situations, depending how you play Warden, that's the type of thing where the flexibility, you have the choice of getting that, assuming you actually have all these traceries. Ambush run speed bonus, as hilarious as that is, not necessarily one I would recommend. Similar with careful step duration and movement speed, that's the type of thing if you use these abilities a lot and you want that playstyle on your Warden, you have the choice, but they're not the most effective. And then hampering javelin duration and reset chance, at the very least this can be good for solo gameplay on the Warden. With 11 and soon to be 12 classes in the game, that was a lot to cover, but I hope it's a helpful starting point for you to set up your allies in the best possible way for your character. I realize some players might be interested in the endgame meta builds for group content, which I do have to stress are going to change with the expansion in late 2023 and ongoing class revamps, but Gingen is another LOTRO content creator who has had a couple guides on traceries geared towards these meta specs and builds. Just like with this video though, I would suggest using resources like that as a starting point and tailoring the recommendations to fit your needs and what resources you actually have, which is basically what I've been stressing throughout this section of the video. And at this point, this guide has covered most legendary items topics, but it would not be a complete guide without mentioning how the ally system factors into other LOTRO systems. In particular here with the LOTRO store. Recently, tracery bundles were added to the store that includes sets of level 131 to 150 traceries. What you get depends on the set that you buy, but this is mostly a pay-to-skip mechanic to quickly get yourself an LI build. And on that note, there are many parts of the LI system that allow you to use mithril coins to boost levels in, say, the reward track or even item levels of tracery slots, but these are not necessarily the greatest values in my experience. Also, if you do use a Valar level boost, whether you get it from like the LOTRO store or from giveaways or from expansion bundles, wherever you get it, these will actually set your character up with a ton of items to get started with the LI system. It is a whole lot to go through, and depending on your familiarity with the class and LI system, it may be overwhelming at the start, but I did want to point out it does give you what you need to build out a couple LIs at least. I really hope that this guide takes some of the stress out of equipping yourself with good allies given the resources that you have. With the new ally system, it really is pretty easy to get yourself a good set of baseline allies. While they won't necessarily be the best, they're a great starting point for all sorts of content in LOTRO, whether you're playing solo and just going through the landscape, or even playing solo with increased landscape difficulty. Maybe you're running delvings and even high tier delvings, or even group content and raiding. While there are a ton of complications with the system, and I basically went through absolutely every part of the system to be thorough in this video, I think just playing around with it will help you get used to the system, and it will feel a lot simpler over time. And that closes out the ultimate LOTRO Legendary Items guide. This video has been a lot of work, so if it did help you, I would definitely appreciate it if you give it a like, and especially just share it with someone that may find it useful. I also encourage you to check out some of the other resources that I have linked in the description. If you are interested, I have a lot of other LOTRO guides, including a big one on leveling and the classes. Otherwise, thank you for watching and have fun with your legendary items.